It was supposed to be a day of joy, a celebration of life, a child's birthday no less. The house was warm, filled with the sweet aroma of vanilla, frosting, and the sound of children's laughter. It was a day that would forever be etched in the memories of those who attended, but not for the reasons anyone could have imagined. The morning began like any other birthday morning, with the excited whispers of little ones eagerly anticipating the afternoon party. The mother, Sarah, had spent the entire night preparing for this day. She wanted everything to be perfect, just as any loving mother would. The centerpiece of her efforts was a homemade cake, meticulously crafted with layers of fluffy sponge, rich chocolate ganache, and a delicate swirl of cream that crowned the top. Sarah had always been meticulous in her baking, a trait passed down from her own mother. But as fate would have it, this day would prove to be an exception. While she rummaged through her pantry in the early hours, her tired eyes scanning for baking powder, her fingers brushed against an unmarked tin. The tin was old, its label long worn away, and she assumed it contained the baking powder she needed. After all, what else could it be? As she measured out the powder and sifted it into the flour, she thought nothing of the slight discoloration in the mixture. It had been years since she last used the contents of that tin, and time, she thought, must have aged it slightly. With a shrug, she continued, humming a soft tune as she worked, unaware that she was sealing the fate of everyone who would take a bite of the cake. The party began in the early afternoon. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the house and garden. Children ran around in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Parents mingled, sipping on lemonade and exchanging pleasantries. Everything was perfect. When it was time for the cake, the children gathered around the table, their eyes wide with anticipation. Sarah carried the cake into the room, a proud smile on her face. The candles were lit, and the room erupted into a chorus of "Happy Birthday." The birthday child, a boy no older than 7, beamed as he blew out the candles in one breath. Applause filled the room, and Sarah began to cut the cake, serving each slice with a mother's loving touch. The first bites were met with eager delight. The cake was as delicious as it looked, or so it seemed. But as the minutes passed, a strange sensation began to ripple through the crowd. It started with a slight discomfort, a queasiness that crept into the stomachs of those who had eaten. At first, it was easy to dismiss, a reaction to too much sugar, perhaps. But the discomfort grew, spreading like a dark cloud over the room. One by one, the children began to pale, their laughter fading into uneasy silence. A mother clutched her stomach, her face contorting in pain. Panic started to spread as more and more guests began to feel the effects. What began as a joyful celebration quickly descended into chaos. Sarah watched in horror as her friends and family doubled over in agony. The realization hit her like a cold slap in the face. The cake. It had to be the cake. But what had gone wrong? Her mind raced, replaying every step she had taken in the kitchen that morning. And then it struck her. The tin. That unmarked tin she had used so carelessly. As the reality of her mistake dawned on her, the scene around her grew more frantic. Some parents rushed their children outside, desperate for fresh air, while others frantically called emergency services. Sarah could barely move, paralyzed by guilt and fear. She had poisoned them, her own family, her friends, the children she had watched grow up alongside her own son. The paramedics arrived quickly, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. Stretchers were brought in, and the guests were rushed to the hospital, their lives hanging in the balance. The once happy home was now filled with the sound of sirens, the air thick with the smell of sickness and fear. At the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to save those who had been affected. It was discovered that the mysterious powder Sarah had used was not baking powder at all, but a toxic substance that had somehow ended up in her pantry, likely from a time long past when such things were kept for less savory purposes. The poison had infiltrated every slice of cake, spreading its deadly effects to all who had partaken. Despite the doctor's best efforts, not everyone could be saved. The older relatives, their bodies too frail to fight off the poison, succumbed to its effects. The news was a crushing blow to Sarah, who could barely comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy she had unwittingly caused. In the days that followed, the house that had once been filled with laughter and light became a place of mourning. The curtains remained drawn, and the sound of children playing was replaced by the quiet sobs of a family in grief. Sarah could not bring herself to step into the kitchen again, the memories of that fateful day too painful to bear. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones about the incident, the story spreading through the town like wildfire. Some pitied Sarah, recognizing the accident for what it was, a terrible, tragic mistake. Others, however, were less forgiving, their judgmental stares and murmurs adding to the weight of her guilt. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but the pain never faded. Sarah became a shadow of her former self, haunted by the ghosts of those she had lost. Every night, she relived the party in her dreams, the joyful faces of the children turning to horror as the poison took hold. She could hear their cries, feel their pain, and she would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a punishment she felt she deserved, a penance for her carelessness. She avoided the friends who had survived, too ashamed to face them, too broken to offer any kind of comfort. Her son, the birthday boy, could not understand why his mother had changed, why she no longer smiled or sang or baked his favorite treats. He too was scarred by the events of that day, his childhood innocence shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. And so, the house remained quiet, its rooms filled with the heavy silence of loss. The once warm and inviting home had become a place of shadows, where the past lingered like a specter, refusing to let go. Sarah knew she would never escape it, the memories of that day forever etched in her mind, a reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers that can lurk in the most unexpected places. In the end, it was not just the cake that had been poisoned, but the lives of everyone who had been touched by that day. The joy, the laughter, the innocence, it had all been tainted, leaving behind a darkness that could never be fully erased. The birthday party that was meant to celebrate life had instead become a haunting memory, a tale of horror that would be whispered about for years to come, long after the last piece of cake had been consumed. On a cool October evening in 2008, a group of teenagers hungry for adventure and the thrill of the unknown set out to celebrate their friend Mark's 17th birthday. They had heard whispers about an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place wrapped in shadowy rumors and half-told tales of misfortune. It was said that the house had stood empty for decades, its darkened windows like the empty eye sockets of a skull, and its sagging roofline casting long, ominous shadows on the overgrown lawn. The house was perfect for a night of daring, a place where the boundaries between the real and the supernatural seemed thin and easily crossed. Mark, eager to prove his bravery, suggested they hold his birthday party there. The others, drawn by the promise of a night filled with spine-chilling excitement, quickly agreed. They arrived just as the last light of day was being swallowed by the approaching night. The house loomed before them, silent and foreboding, its wooden walls weathered and peeling, as though the structure itself was slowly rotting away. The air around it felt thick and heavy, almost as if the house exhaled a breath of decay and despair. The trees nearby, gnarled and twisted, seemed to lean inwards, their branches forming a tangled web over the roof. As they pushed open the creaking door, it was clear that time had not been kind to the house. The floors were uneven, covered in a thick layer of dust that kicked up in clouds with every step they took. Old furniture, draped in tattered sheets, stood like forgotten ghosts, and the walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper that seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light of their flashlights. But the group, fueled by nervous laughter and the need to impress one another, shrugged off the creeping unease that clung to them. They set up in the living room, a once grand space now reduced to a ruin of what it had been. Mark, always the leader, produced a bottle of whiskey he had stolen from his father's cabinet, and they took turns passing it around, each sip burning away a bit of their fear. Music from a small speaker crackled in the still air, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence that filled the house. For a while, they managed to ignore the unsettling atmosphere, their voices loud and brash as they dared one another to explore the different rooms. But as the night wore on, and the bottle grew lighter, their bravado began to wane. The old house seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and shifting in ways that made them uneasy. It was then, as the hour grew late and the alcohol dulled their senses, that they noticed the trapdoor. It was half hidden beneath a tattered rug in the corner of the room, its edges barely visible in the flickering light. Intrigued and slightly drunk, Mark pulled the rug aside to reveal a small iron-ringed door set into the floorboards. The ring was cold to the touch, and the wood around it felt damp, as if it had been soaked in something far more sinister than water. "Let's see where it leads," Mark suggested, his voice slurred but eager. The others hesitated, the weight of something dark and unspoken pressing down on them. But no one wanted to be the one to back out, not after coming this far. So, with a collective breath held, Mark pulled open the trapdoor. A rush of cold air escaped from the opening, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something rotten. The stairs beneath were narrow and steep, leading down into an inky blackness that swallowed the light of their flashlights almost immediately. The group exchanged nervous glances, but Mark was already descending, his feet echoing hollowly on the steps. They followed him down into the dark, their flashlights barely piercing the thick gloom. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls closing in around them. The staircase seemed to go on forever, a winding path into the bowels of the earth. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their own breathing, quick and shallow. Finally, they reached the bottom. The basement was larger than they had anticipated, a vast cavernous space with a low ceiling that seemed to press down on them. The walls were rough stone, damp to the touch, and the floor was uneven, covered in a layer of loose dirt that crunched underfoot. But what drew their attention, what froze the blood in their veins, was the object in the center of the room. It was a large rectangular stone slab, like an altar, covered in ancient faded symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. The slab was stained dark with something long dried, and the air around it was thick with the metallic scent of old blood. But it was what lay atop the slab that sent a shiver of primal fear through their bodies. A human skeleton, its bones yellowed with age, was splayed across the stone. The skull was tilted at an odd angle, as if it had been twisted violently. Rusted chains were attached to the skeleton's wrists and ankles, binding it to the slab in a mockery of life. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare up at them, accusing, pleading, as if the soul that had once inhabited this body was still trapped, waiting for release. A collective gasp escaped the group, the sound almost swallowed by the oppressive silence. For a long moment, no one moved, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. But then, as if the discovery had broken some ancient seal, the air around them seemed to thicken, growing colder, and a deep, resonant sound began to fill the room, a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the very walls. Panic set in. One of the girls, Sarah, screamed, the sound piercing the darkness like a knife. She turned and bolted up the stairs, the others quickly following, their footsteps a chaotic scramble of fear. Mark was the last to leave, his eyes locked on the skeleton as if it had spoken to him, whispered some terrible truth that he couldn't escape. But even he turned and fled, the weight of that gaze following him up the stairs. They burst into the living room, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The house, once merely old and abandoned, now felt alive with malevolent energy. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. The door, their only escape, stood just a few feet away, but the distance felt insurmountable, as if the house itself was holding them back, dragging them deeper into its dark heart. They reached the door and tore it open, spilling out into the night. The air outside was sharp and cold, biting into their skin. But it was a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. They ran without looking back, the sound of the door slamming shut behind them, echoing in their ears like a gunshot. They didn't stop running, until they reached the edge of town, where the familiar lights of civilization finally brought them some measure of comfort. But the experience had changed them. The terror they had felt in that basement, the sight of the skeleton, and the haunting wail that had followed them still lingered in their minds, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. For weeks after, they tried to return to their normal lives, but the memory of that night clung to them like a shadow. They stopped talking about it, hoping that by ignoring it, the fear would fade. But it didn't. Mark, in particular, became increasingly withdrawn, his once bright personality dulled by a deep-seated anxiety that he couldn't shake. He started having nightmares, vivid dreams where he was back in that basement, chained to the slab, unable to move as the darkness closed in around him. Then, one night, Mark vanished. His parents found his room empty, the window wide open, a trail of dirt leading from his bed to the street outside. The others, terrified that whatever had taken him might come for them next, finally broke their silence and went to the police. But when they returned to the house with officers in tow, they found it burned to the ground, nothing left but charred remains and ashes. The basement, the trapdoor, and the skeleton were gone as if they had never existed. Mark was never found. Some say he was claimed by the spirits that haunted the house, that he now roams the ruins, trapped in that eternal darkness. Others whisper that the house still stands, appearing to those who seek it out, its doors always open to those foolish enough to enter. But the group, those who survived, never spoke of it again. They moved on with their lives, but the shadow of that night hung over them like a curse, a constant reminder that some places are best left undisturbed, and some doors should never be opened. The night had fallen heavy over the quiet New Jersey neighborhood, the thick inky darkness swallowing the last remnants of daylight. In one particular house, laughter and shrieks of delight echoed from the backyard, where a small group of children were gathered to celebrate little Emily's 7th birthday. The backyard was festooned with bright balloons and colorful streamers, the air thick with the scent of sugary cake and the sound of playful giggles. But beneath the cheerful facade, an unsettling aura hung in the air, as if the night itself held its breath in anticipation of something sinister. It was the kind of night where the shadows seemed deeper, where every rustle of leaves or creak of a gate sent a shiver down your spine. And it was on this very night that the Robinson family made a decision they would come to regret: hiring the clown. The idea had seemed innocent enough. Emily had always loved clowns, those bright, smiling faces with their oversized shoes and playful antics. So when her parents found a flyer advertising Giggles the Clown, they thought it was perfect. They'd never heard of this particular clown before, but the flyer promised a show full of fun, magic, and endless laughter. How could they resist? When the doorbell rang, signaling Giggles' arrival, the children rushed to the front door in a frenzy of excitement. Emily's father, Mark, opened the door with a wide smile, but it quickly faded as he took in the figure before him. The clown standing on the porch was nothing like they had expected. Giggles was tall and thin, his frame almost skeletal beneath the bright, oversized costume. His makeup was heavy and crude, with a grotesque painted-on grin that stretched unnervingly across his face. His eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, seemed to bore into Mark's soul, and for a fleeting moment he felt a deep instinctual unease. But the children didn't notice. They were already clamoring around the clown, pulling him into the house, eager for the entertainment to begin. Mark forced a smile, brushing off the strange feeling, and led Giggles into the backyard where the party was in full swing. The show started out as expected. Giggles pulled out a few simple magic tricks, making coins disappear and pulling colorful scarves from his sleeve. But there was something off about the way he performed. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and his voice, thin and raspy, seemed to scrape against the air, sending chills down the spines of the adults watching. The children, however, didn't seem to notice, at least not at first. But as the show progressed, the atmosphere began to shift. Giggles' jokes became darker, more twisted, as if he were speaking a language only the adults could understand. His tricks became unsettling, flowers that withered and died as soon as they were pulled from his hat, and a puppet that seemed to have a life of its own. its eyes following the children as it was manipulated by Giggles's thin, bony fingers. The parents exchanged uneasy glances, but it wasn't until Giggles began to speak directly to the children that true fear began to seep into the party. "You know," Giggles rasped, his voice low and menacing, "clowns are always watching. Even when you don't see us, we're there, in the dark, waiting." A hush fell over the backyard as the children stared up at the clown with wide eyes. Giggles leaned in closer to one of the children, a little boy who had been giggling just moments before. The clown's painted-on grin seemed to stretch wider as he whispered something in the boy's ear. Whatever he said, it wiped the smile right off the boy's face, replacing it with a look of pure terror. The boy burst into tears, scrambling back to his mother, burying his face in her dress. Panic rippled through the group of children as they all began to cry, their earlier excitement replaced with a palpable fear. The air was thick with tension, the parents' discomfort turning into alarm. Mark, who had been watching from the sidelines, stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's enough," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Thank you, but I think it's time for the show to end." Giggles turned to Mark, those dark, hollow eyes locking onto his. For a moment, the clown just stood there, his painted grin frozen in place. Then, without a word, he turned and began to gather his things, his movements slow and deliberate. As Giggles made his way out of the backyard, the children clung to their parents, their eyes wide with fear. Mark followed the clown to the front door, eager to get him out of the house as quickly as possible. As Giggles stepped onto the porch, he paused, turning back to Mark one last time. "I'll see you all again. Very soon," Giggles whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of Mark's heart. And then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence in his wake. The party ended shortly after, the once lively atmosphere now somber and tense. The children, usually so difficult to corral after such excitement, were quiet and subdued, their eyes darting nervously around as if expecting Giggles to reappear at any moment. That night, Emily had nightmares. She woke up screaming, terrified that the clown was hiding in her closet under her bed waiting to drag her away. Her parents did their best to comfort her, but even they couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over the house like a dark cloud. A few days later, the unease turned to fear when the Robinsons saw a news report about a man who had been arrested in a nearby town. The man was wanted for a series of disturbing crimes, his last known disguise, Giggles the Clown. The picture on the screen was unmistakable. It was the same man who had stood in their backyard just days before, the same man who had whispered those terrifying words to the children. The realization sent a cold wave of dread through the family. The thought of that man, that monster being so close to their children in their home, was almost too much to bear. They could only be grateful that he hadn't done more harm. But the story didn't end there. Weeks passed, and while life slowly returned to normal, there was an underlying tension that never fully dissipated. Then, one night, as the Robinsons were settling down for bed, they heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle echoing through the house. At first, they thought it was Emily, still troubled by nightmares. But when they went to check on her, they found her sound asleep. The giggling continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling the house with that eerie, familiar sound. It was coming from the living room. Mark and his wife crept downstairs, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they entered the room, the giggling stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. But the silence was short-lived. A single balloon, bright red and floating lazily in the center of the room, caught their attention. It wasn't there before. Neither of them had bought it, nor had they seen it earlier. It bobbed gently, swaying as if moved by an invisible hand. And then, as they watched in horror, the balloon began to deflate, hissing softly as the air escaped, forming a twisted, deflated smile as it shriveled. They never found out how the balloon got there. They never heard the giggling again. But the memory of that night and of the clown who had brought so much terror into their lives stayed with them, haunting their dreams and their waking moments. And though the days passed and life moved on, There was always a part of them that wondered, that feared, that perhaps Giggles wasn't done with them yet, that maybe one day he would return, creeping out of the darkness, bringing with him the kind of terror that only a clown with a painted smile and hollow eyes could invoke. Because clowns, as Giggles had said, are always watching, waiting.